All right. Welcome, everyone. It is great to see all the people joining on and our esteemed speakers for today. My name is Randy Wadera, and I am the Director of Philanthropy here at the California State Parks Foundation. And as in this role, I get to work with our wonderful donors and supporters. I also oversee our endowments and funds and our unique model here. I also work in programs, working on our partnerships and granting program, our statewide volunteerism program. I also oversee our Living Shoreline project up at Yosemite Slough and the rehabilitation of Pigeon Point. So I get to be involved in a lot of great things. One of the things that I've been involved in for the past few years is our Wildfires initiative, and that's why we are here today. I see that people are already using the chat to introduce themselves. We have people from all around California and some outside. So please introduce yourself, where you're from. It's great to see all of you kind of typing in the chat. So here's a few rules of engagement for this morning. We've got a lot to go through. We've got a lot of great stuff to talk about and great work that's being done. Everyone will be on mute other than the speakers, and questions can be asked through the chat function. We do have quite a few people scheduled to be here today. And so I'm working with staff from behind the scenes who will be making sure that during the Q&A time that I will get questions. And but please, when you're using the chat function, please be respectful to each other through that chat function. So thank you all for joining us for this first Insider Speaker Series. This virtual event is for members and donors of California State Parks Foundation to learn more about a topic that we are working on with state parks. You will hear from experts in the field, and you will get multiple perspectives on the topic. And what is so important to us at the foundation is that all of our work is deeply rooted in understanding and learning about the issues that we're fighting for and the issues that we're working on. And today is a great opportunity for you, our members and donors, to be partners with us in that learning. Of course, wildfires has affected everyone in California. It's changed our whole vocabulary. We now think about whether it's the CZU, glass, mosquito. Our whole lexicon has been changed because of the greater occurrence of wildfires. We have a wildfire season now in California. One of the most dramatic impacts of a changing climate on California state parks and the system has been this increased occurrence and severity of wildfires. Since the historic 2020 fire season, though, California state parks, with your support, has been working hand in hand with California state parks and our park partners to protect and restore our state parks while supporting models of preparation that help state parks adapt to this growing threat. From Rancho Cuyamaca down near the Mexican border to Clear Lake, the urban state parks of Los Angeles to Big Basin Redwood state parks and throughout California, we have been funding projects of restoration, education, preparation, and prevention. And thanks to all of you, we are really learning about the critical work so that we can advocate for scaling that work in Sacramento to make sure that our California state parks are building resiliency and that we are supporting these folks that are doing incredible work. And we do have a wonderful team of folks for you to hear from. I just wanted to mention a little story. Is many of you know that Yosemite was the very first state park, even though it's not a state park currently. That's a different story. But if you read the history of Yosemite and the early conservation movement, there were people who really understood that the indigenous tribes of Yosemite were using fires to manage Yosemite as a park. And it was a conscious decision that was made to stop the use of controlled of burning to actually help the management of those natural systems, which was part for millennia. So wildfire is sort of deeply rooted in California in our natural systems. It is a part of really what makes these natural systems work. And today we're going to learn from these experts in the field about the current and future landscape of wildfires and surrounding the issue. So what we'll start is I will introduce the speakers one by one. They'll have each a chance to talk a little bit about sort of the work that they're doing. Then I have some questions, and then we'll open it up to chat questions from everybody. I'd like to acknowledge, though, first that there are wildfires burning right now, like the mosquito fire, the Fairview fire, the mountain fire, and more. And we're thinking of those who are impacted by those incidents. Specifically, the largest, the mosquito fire, is affecting several state parks. Auburn State Recreation, Marshall Gold Discovery, and Folsom Lake State Recreation are three parks that are currently being affected by the wildfires currently going on. So it's an amazing issue to have us wrestle with as Californians. And I want to start off by introducing our first speaker, Jessica Morris, who's the Deputy Secretary of Forest and Wildland Resilience at the California Natural Resources Agency. Jessica is coordinating California's approach to wildfire resilience, including increasing the pace and scale of forest restoration and vegetation treatment. Jessica was the architect of the governor's $1.5 billion wildfire resiliency strategy and developed the joint forest stewardship strategy between California and the U.S. Forest Service, signed in 2020. And before I hand it over to you, Jessica, I believe that you have a family home that is potentially affected by the mosquito fire. And I'm sorry, I hope everything is good there. But thank you so much for being here and sharing what you have to say with us today.
Thank you so much, Randy. And it's really nice to be here with all of you. And, you know, like many Californians, I think all of us have either our direct homes, our family homes, our relatives, our friends are in the path of these fires, right? It's hard to avoid. So yes, my family in Gold Run, fortunately, we're safe. Our forest land is safe, and has been fine from the mosquito fire and another small one that had broken out right just a couple miles away from it. And so, you know, but this is the reality that we're living with now. And so that's part of the reason that I've been really grateful to be in this role, to be able to dedicate time, energy, effort to asking, how do we rethink our approach to fire? How do we make government resources more nimble and direct to be able to actually help tackle this crisis head on? Because this is not the fire crisis that I grew up with. This is not the fire crisis that these are not sort of the natural fires that have been present on California's landscape for millennia. So at the state level, we're really trying to tackle this problem set of how do we get to a spot, even in the age of climate change, with our forests and wildlands kind of out of balance from their natural states. How do we get them back into a future state of resilience so that when fire strikes, it's fine. It plays its actual natural ecological role for those landscapes and those ecologies, and also keeps communities safe. So as you heard, we launched $1.5 billion last year, which is a huge surge in funding. Our funding base for this had been $200 million. Starting in 2018 was the first time you really saw investments in fire resilience. And then this just last week, Governor signed another $1.3 billion for wildfire resilience. So that means in just over a 3-year period, we're going to have $2.8 billion on the ground. That has launched over 1,000 projects already with last year's funding throughout the state. And those projects span kind of 3 fronts of fire resilience. It's investments inside of communities, such as home hardening, defensible space, making communities more ember resistant when fires come through. It's putting investments around communities, that's shaded fuel breaks, strategic fuel breaks that aid evacuations, give firefighters that tactical advantage on the ground. And then the last round is what we're really talking about with state parks, which is that landscape level resilience. How do we get our ecologies back to their natural fire regimes? What do we have to do by hand? Are we applying the right science? Are we hitting the right scale? and for you guys to know that what was new in our new approach to wildfire resilience in the state is that this wasn't just sort of a one and done investment, that we invested across 40 different programs across 22 departments. It's an all hands on deck approach. This was the first time that state parks and Department of Fish and Wildlife had direct funding for wildfire resilience, which you guys know at the State Park Foundation has been crucial and missing. This is some of the most unique biodiversity and unique ecology on the planet. And so it's really important that we protect it and get it back into its natural fire regime state, as opposed to these catastrophic mega fires, which are very out of balance. And so really excited to join the conversation today and dig in on some of this. There's a lot of innovative thinking. There's a lot of partners on the ground, but California is doing more than ever on wildfire and really investing in that prevention on the front end. How do we prevent catastrophic mega fires and get back to a state of natural, ecological, safe fire on the ground?
Thank you so much, Jessica, and I'm glad that your home is safe too. And thank you for your work and that you're doing on behalf of California and state parks. We appreciate it greatly. Next, my honor to introduce Assembly Member Bennett, who launched his bid for the Assembly with a recognition that the window to effectively address climate change is rapidly closing. We really appreciate that leadership. His first climate change effort focused on improving storage capacity of renewable energy, which is an essential step to achieving the goal of 100% renewable energy. Mr. Bennett, thank you for joining us today, and you have the stage.
Hey, thank you very much, Randy. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time to pull this together, you and the foundation. And the reason I particularly appreciate that is I started my career on Budget Sub 3 2 years ago when I was recently elected. And my first question was, how do we know all this money is going to be invested in the highest priority expenditures, et cetera? And the only way we're going to find that out is for us to pull together, have good conversations, try to find out what best practices are from each other, and then try to hold ourselves accountable to spend it really well. So thank you for doing this. As I just mentioned, I serve on Budget Sub 3. Budget Sub 3 does the funding for Cal Fire. It does the funding for state parks, does the funding for a number of these state agencies that are going to be heavily involved in this fire resiliency issue. One of the reasons that I asked the question I did is we have such variety in terms of landscape and terrain here in California. Where I live in Ventura County, we've been swept with many major fires. All 5 houses across the street from my house fire. The 4 houses on my side have a chaparral area. We don't have the background of your picture. And yet I realize a large part of California has a completely different and heavily forested landscape. And so we have to really be sensitive to all of that. And that's my interaction with this, and I look forward, particularly through Budget Sub 3, to keep working with the foundation on this project. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Bennett. We really appreciate it. Now, I'd like to introduce Steve Otten. Steve Otten and Steve Otten Resources Consulting staff have been working in Big Basin Redwood State Park, Butano, and Año Nuevo State Parks following the CZU fire, CZU Lightning Complex fire of 2020. Their role has been to work with California State Park staff and conduct field investigations, considering current forest conditions, make vegetation and tree treatment recommendations, and develop a forest management plan, and apply for those permits to implement ecological restorative treatments across those 3 state parks. Steve is working on the ground, has a long history working on issues like this, and we're so privileged to have you, Steve. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much for that, Randy, and really a great tie-in with what Jessica mentioned, Assemblymember Bennett. And wonder if I could just share screen a bit just to talk briefly about what's happening, like what Jessica and Assemblymember Bennett are talking about on the funding. I just want to show a quick rendition of how this funding is starting to be used on the ground.
Sounds great.
And can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, this is going to be quick because I know it's only like 3 minutes here, but and this is outside of Big Basin State Park, right? And so this is more of like our 30,000 foot view of what's happening. And Big Basin has a lot different thought process about what's happening in potential treatment zones, but how are treatment zones being created on the landscape level? For example, this is a picture of all the parcels. This is San Jose, and this is the Santa Cruz Mountains, and this is the Lexington Reservoir. And the first question you ask is, where does everyone live? What's the potential for fire severity, right? And that you can see the higher fire severity behind Lexington. What's the fire history, right? So we can see where all the historical fires are. And then we look at it from a prevailing wind setting. We've actually reversed the screen to look right down this field of view to see where the historic fires are. San Jose, Santa Cruz Mountains. Then we find out, well, what is Cal Fire? What does the unit fire folks want to do? And we look at what their projects are. And then after that, we add a slope analysis to GIS. And that's all this darker green shading. So we're thinking about, how does wind flow down the canyon? How would fire move down this canyon? What are the most reasonable places to apply treatments? And then we pick those treatment areas out, right? And looking at this area right here, this is Bear Creek Redwoods Open Space Preserve at Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District on the top of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we're going to do a straight up view look at it. And then how do we think about our sensitive resources? Super important to Big Basin. We add our water courses, our wet areas, and then we apply those treatments that you saw in yellow. That's the slope of the ground. Where is it reasonable for us to operate and protect sensitive resources? We add the treatment zones, and then we go out and we take a look at these and field verify them and figure out how are we going to get to all these places. Super quick 30,000 foot view. And the big part of it that's really important is when we take a look at this, this is now a 3-dimensional version. Did your screen change? And can you see this project? Okay, here's Lexington, here's San Jose, here's the Santa Cruz Mountains. And then when we start laying this down in 3-dimensional, you can start seeing how the green highlights the ridges along the side and puts protection measures in around the community. So that's a lot of how this money is being applied on the ground. This is the Los Gatos Creek Watershed Collaborative Project. It's a forest health grant project. And with that, so that's a lot of what we're doing. And we'll talk about what happens in those polygons in the question set. Thank you.
Wow, it's great to kind of get from Assemblymember Bennett and Jessica sort of the big picture, and Steve to kind of see how that's being applied. And now I total pleasure to introduce a longtime colleague, Tim Highland, who's the Natural Resources Program Manager for the Santa Cruz District. Tim's a local man, born in San Jose, and he spent 27 years helping to protect the incredible biodiversity of the Santa Cruz Mountains found in our local state parks. During that time, he's assisted in and currently directs the prescribed fire program for the district, helping to maintain the various ecosystems by reintroducing fire to the redwood forest, coastal prairie, and the rare sandhill chaparral. Tim, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work you're doing.
Okay, thanks, Randy. Randy asked me to talk about lessons learned from the CZU complex fire. We're zooming in even further, right, from a statewide down to a particular incident and how it impacted the oldest state park currently functioning as a state park, and that was Big Basin Redwood State Park. And that fire really, I think the biggest lesson that the takeaway from that fire was looking at how the facilities were impacted by the landscape that they were in and how they also impacted that landscape. So as many of you may know, we lost basically all of the facilities, historic lodge, the visitor center that were in the park. But many of you may not know that actually when those facilities burned down, they contributed to the damage to the trees surrounding them, right? There was a desire when that park was created to get people in to see these incredible trees. And so we put a lot of infrastructure right down in the middle of the prime resource. And that had a lot of unintended consequences. In order to bring utilities to that facility, then you had to cut trees down to protect power lines. Once they were there, you also had to potentially, now you'd created a target. So you have these great 1,000-year-old trees, but if they were structurally unsound and they could hit these facilities, then you might actually have to take them out, and some of them were taken out. And then finally, when we had this catastrophic event of the CZU fire, these trees were further undermined, one by the buildings burning down. It's true that the trees carried the fire, but once these buildings lit on fire, they impacted these old growth trees. And then finally, then even once those buildings were gone, crews had to come in and clean them up. And so in order to make it safe for those crews to work in the park to clean up, the toxic materials that were there and the debris that was there, that put them in harm's way. So we again had to look at the potential hazard of these trees. So it just, over the course of these facilities' existence, they really, although they provided incredible benefit to park visitors, they really have impacted and the natural resources that the visitors came to see. So I think that the big takeaway for parks from this wildfire and other wildfires in forested areas is that we have to think really, really carefully about where we put these kinds of facilities in the future so that we can both provide for public access and not endanger the resource that the public came to see.
Thank you, Tim. And I just love the way the setup of today's, so where we get the broad view down to right, sort of the specific view. And I know that everybody feels that throughout California and felt when Big Basin and the fire came through, and being sort of the oldest and one of cherished by so many. And so thank you for all your work on Big Basin and the incredible effort to kind of reintroduce some access currently. It's amazing. All right, so a couple questions that we have prepared, and I know that just to remind people, if you have questions and you want to start to add them to the chat so we can continue the conversation. But first question that I have is for Assemblymember Bennett, and you mentioned about sort of how diverse California is, and we really see that in our work. Like I said, from Rancho Cuyamaca down by Anza Borrego up to Clear Lake and along in the Bay Area to Tahoe. It's really diverse landscape and diverse communities. How can the state approach writing and implementing policy to increase wildfire resiliency given this diversity?
Hey, it's a huge challenge, and I certainly won't be able to cover all of that right now. But first, you have to recognize that we have that diversity. So you don't write a policy that is a one-size-fits-all policy. I think the state's learned that over the years and does a pretty good job of trying to identify grants and then trying to invite local organizations, local entities to apply and have those entities justify why they have a solution that's particularly good for their area. The other thing is to try to increase the collaboration between all of the various state agencies. So we have, the state agencies that are out there, state parks, state parks gives us valuable information about the variety of landscape that is out there. Same thing with the Department of Water Resources, CAL FIRE. So we're pretty experienced in California at dealing with that. It's making sure we have the flexibility to let the locals weigh in. But I want to offer one final thing here, and that is somehow that also makes it harder to know whether you're prioritizing the best investments or whether you're prioritizing the investments that politically somehow rose to the top at that particular local level. And so I'm really intrigued by Steve Austin's explanation as to sort of where and how they decided they needed to do the most work. And so I would like to have California come up with some kind of parameters or standards that we could use to measure these applications by, so we could prioritize and say, at least we know we've invested in the most important areas in terms of general community risk and benefit and stuff. So that's basically how we address that.
That's great. And actually probably a great segue to talking a little more to Jessica. You might want to address that topic. And also the question is, in 2021, the legislature and the governor committed that $1.5 billion in state funding for 3 years of projects that restore wildfire resilience by increasing the pace and scale of fuel management and reduction. Along with sort of, I think what Assemblymember Bennett was talking about is like, how do we assess that? And is maybe some of the success stories and what are we learning from the state of where we need to go from here forward?
Perfect. I'll just take the next half hour and talk you through it. No, just kidding. So basically what we need, so to address kind of the first part of what Assemblymember Bennett was talking about, that targeting our investments strategically so that they both keep communities safe, meet the fire resilience goals, but also promote our ecological equities such as watershed health, carbon storage on the landscape, biodiversity, right? That when you're addressing wildfire resilience, you can actually get all of these community and ecological benefits in place. And so, so out of the funding we invested last year, we did invest in something that really targets in that regional and local knowledge so that you don't have some type of sort of universal prescription across the whole landscape, but instead it's adapted to rolling oak woodlands, coastal redwoods, high alpine upper watersheds, coastal sage and chaparral. And so making sure that the right resilience treatment is put onto the correct landscape. So we invested in a couple things that do that. We invested in something called the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program that really builds in those local collaboratives so that all these grant dollars we have can then funnel into full regional strategies. San Diego was a great success story of that, where San Diego County was an early pilot of this regional approach, and their resource conservation district partnered with the state conservancy in San Diego, as well as CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service. They designed a regional strategy, so it would have looked sort of like a heat map of what Steve was showing you, where it identified where the highest fire risks were across the landscape, regardless of that mosaic of jurisdictions. And so then when this funding came through last April was the first surge of it. The legislature gave us emergency funding in April to really get this pipeline of projects done. It allowed us to then have dollars to invest in what the regional collaborative had already used science to identify were their highest priorities. So that invested in strategic fuel breaks around the community. One caught a fire on Thanksgiving Day, so just a few months after the funding came out, on Thanksgiving Day in the city of Santee. 18-acre fire on a red flag warning day would have potentially wiped out the neighborhood. CAL FIRE was able to then use that fuel break that they had put in place in record time to be able to hold that fire. They also invested that same regional strategy also said, hey, we actually need to have community chipping and defensible space for elderly and vulnerable people who can't do it themselves. And so they went through and did 800 homes within the first year of that program. So, and it just keeps going, right? There were hundreds of projects just in that in that area alone. And so what we're seeing is that by establishing regional collaboratives, having those staffing dollars and those planning dollars in place allows us to then have a much more targeted approach that's scientifically based on the different ecologies throughout the state. One other thing we're investing in to really help us better target our dollars is to ensure that we're investing in science and better data, because the knowledge we had 10 years ago and the assumptions we had 10 years ago don't hold. Even the assumptions made in 2018 in the fourth climate assessment, that assessment came out in 2018. It predicted that we would see 77% more acres burn annually by 2100. But we actually hit that target in 2020 by having 1500% more acres burn. You know, and so when we're seeing those annual acres increase very dramatically, very quickly in California, we're outpacing the climate assessments, which means we're also outpacing some of the knowledge and models that we've had that have held previously. And so that's why it's really critical to ensure that we're making decisions in planning based on real conditions on the ground, as well as incorporating future conditions. So we're investing in LiDAR across the state so that you can have a very accurate, detailed snapshot of the forest story, the topography, and the understory. We're investing in ground data. So the Forest Service and the state have these plots that they've been taking, like thousands of plots throughout the state across different ecosystems, where they take an inventory of the forest and do studies. They usually go back every 10 years. So you have this timeline of data. We're trying to speed that up. So we invested so that we're now taking that ground data assessment of the biology and the state of trees and chaparral to every 5 years, so that we're keeping pace more with the rapid changes we're seeing with climate change. And then we're taking, and there's, we're investing in vegetation change detection technology, which allows us to see, did the fuel break we put on the ground, did that actually change the vegetation type, or did it do its purpose, which was to maintain that forested ecology or that shrubland that was native, and also allows us to see post-fire or anticipate where you're getting tree mortality from drought and heat. And so, so making sure that forested ecologies stay forested, that native chaparral don't convert to invasive grasses, that we're trying to prevent vegetation change with all this. So there's a lot of investments in data and technology, and next week we'll be announcing a partnership we have with Google.org, where they have been helping us take the models and the science and the data and turn it into a very user-friendly, intuitive tool that looks somewhat similar to the analysis that Steve did, but it includes all of those biological needs as well as public safety. And so to make it easier for people to plan across the different landscapes and ensure that we're maximizing the benefits. And then to answer your last question, Randy, in terms of what did we really get from $1.5 billion and what do we hope to get out of the 1.3? So, I mean, just put a pin in this, guys. $2.8 billion in resilience alone. That's in addition to suppression. And that's unprecedented, right? We're outspending the Fed. And so California is really leading the way that is demonstrating you have to make that sizable investment. But for us, we also knew we had to be fast. That wildfires do not wait for budget cycles. They don't wait for contracting processes. They don't wait for our environmental review timelines. So we asked ourselves, how can we condense all of our bureaucratic timelines so that they're down to just the substance of fiduciary responsibility, ecological oversight that's needed without the long timeframes. So the legislature suspended or gave us relief on contracting processes. We changed our grant timelines. We have a new environmental review document that takes the CEQA process down from 2 years to about a month. And so because of those adaptations, we were actually able to see some projects get on the ground. Usually it takes about a year once you get an appropriation to have a project on the ground. We had some already on the ground within 4 weeks. And so that's how some of these projects caught fires last fire season. And most of them were, we had 1,000 on the ground, and, they're of varying scales. So that's why I'm not saying completed or not completed, because fuel breaks are, fuel reduction type work is never done. But what we saw is we had almost 1,000 projects on the ground, and they've been catching fires this season and last season. So the Electra fire, for example, in Amador County early on, that went out, that hit a fuel reduction project that we had put on the ground on day one. It was going to be a potentially very big fire. It was shooting off pyrocumulus. And so I stood on the line there. It arrested the fire. It burned under sort of oak grasslands. The trees were beautiful underneath it. It looked like a healthy burn where that fuel reduction had taken place. The homes were standing on the other side of it. And so we're seeing example after example of the fuel breaks that we've put in place and the fuel reduction efforts making a huge impact here. I mean, for example, even like with state parks, right? They were able to get curtain burners, which meant they didn't have to wait for burn windows to be able to handle their slash piles, you know, and we also are investing in wood industries that will actually consume that for a higher use, whether that's jet fuel or liquid natural gas or, you know, construction. But for now, you know, while those new technologies develop or expand, also having sort of tools in place that allows state parks, for example, Annandale State Park in Sonoma County, dealt with their slash piles quickly, which meant that this fire season, that state park is not a risk to the communities around them. So that's what we're trying to get. And we saw state parks also really increase their prescribed burns because they were able to procure additional trucks to be able to do that work on the ground. And then to Tim's point, one thing that we just put in the budget this year that I'm excited to roll out is funding for our state facilities in state parks, Fish and Wildlife, and Conservation Corps to be able to do the home hardening defensible space standards so that you're not having the buildings that we have in place endangering the ecology and you're protecting those assets as well for the public. So we're really excited that this is moving quickly and it seems to be effective already just based on the fires that have been mitigated based on the work that everybody's put on the ground.
Amazing. That's wonderful, Jessica. And so many, I mean, I think you've hit so many of the questions that I see coming in about concerns that folks have and how this investment is really addressing those. A question for Steve I have here is, you know, and I know that you do a lot of on the ground looking, and I know that Steve, you're looking at sort of whole landscapes, but you know, what are the factors in terms of wildfire resiliency that go through your mind when you're evaluating and looking at a particular landscape and thinking about creating that forest management plan? So like on that ground level basis, what are the things that you're thinking in terms of the work you're doing?
Well, I mean, every system's a little bit different, and in a lot of ways, the systems have changed significantly, right? Without our frequency return intervals of fire being altered, and those systems being, you know, overstocked a lot with lots of undergrowth. And how do we work with that? So a lot of times when I walk into a system and I look at it, I'm looking at the system for what is this system now? What is this vegetative community made up of? And what will it be in the future? You know, how is it going to change over time? And then asking myself, what are the possible variations it could end up in based on treatments that you might apply to it, right? And so in some ways, this might best be shown with a few photos, if everybody's ready for that. And I think this kind of ties into our work. You know, we feel we're honored to work with Tim Highland and staff at the different state parks, and that they have such a ton of experience, and we come with a level of experience, and there's so much collaboration and partnership, not only going on amongst the large landowners in different communities like the project we mentioned, but also on this drill down scale, right? And can everybody see my screen on the here with the pictures on it? So this is a picture that last project was a forest health grant. This is another forest health grant that comes from Cal Fire, and it's in the redwoods, and it had a slow backing fire happen to it in the CZU lightning fire, and so we. Excuse me. And we evaluated these treatment areas, just like we laid out the different treatment polygons. Then we go evaluate them on the ground. We see what the understory looks like, and we're like, okay, we had a lot of mortality in here. We want to treat a low understory diameter, and that's the follow-up, right? Of what the treatment looked like after we did an understory removal up to 8 inches in diameter, because we're trying to promote this redwood system. Oaks, mast producing species are super important. And then if we flip to the big basin style of thought process, everybody knows what that is, right? Old growth redwood tree, huckleberry, some younger second growth system in there. And how do we create a level of resiliency in this system over time by treatments? And again, this next treatment shows a change where we maintain a level of down woody debris over time, but we're also, those orange flags show retention on different pockets of understory. So we have the arena where we operate, where we're next to communities, and that's asset liability. And we will definitely move towards more of a fuels reduction. But as we get out into our systems, we think about, well, how do we manage them to encourage them? Because we want to maintain this system over time and reduce competition. So next example is a little bit different type. This is from a fire prevention grant down in San Luis Obispo County in the town of Cambria. And this is a Monterey pine stand, right? There's only 3 native Monterey pine stands in California, and we're working in one of them. It's right next to a community, but at the same time, it has a huge importance for resiliency and thinking about how we conduct treatments there, right? This stand saw a large die-off of trees from bark beetle related from pitch canker in 2015. And so there's a good regenerative understory, but look at the amount of down woody debris. So how do we maintain a level of component? We want to maintain the resiliency of the stand. And there's the follow-up treatment afterwards, right? Well, we're still maintaining a healthier understory of trees that are representative by oaks and toyon and down woody debris. And similarly, same idea, Monterey pine stand forest, down wood from a tree that had to be felled because it was a hazard near assets. But then that's what the treatment looks like afterwards, right? So it's really about changing the ladder fuels in the structure. But again, coming back to it, it's you go into a system and you use all your experiences and your other professionals like state parks. You look at them and you're like, okay, what's the best thing for us? And in a lot of these cases, we're doing an understory treatment or a dead and dying tree treatment, and the recognition that burning is still so important to our system, and knowing that that's a direction that state parks wants to move. And how do we, as a group of foresters working with state parks, come together, collaborate, and realize our different experiences and talents, and let's bring those together to try to move towards these outcomes that we want to obtain towards resiliency and a level of fuels reduction at the same time. Thank you.
That's great. I mean, I love how that just sort of just brings that all to scope. It's like we can keep that natural environment, but we can improve it through this work so that it's more resilient. That's wonderful, Steve. Thank you for that. Hey, Tim, I know we have some slides on a deck that I'd like where you could talk a little bit more about the on the ground work that you've been doing. Can I call those up, and can you take us through that real quickly?
Sure. And I mean, this is, go ahead and let's go to the next slide. I mean, one of the things everybody talks about is how fire is unavoidable in California, right? But I just like to explain why that is. So this is a graph of temperature, that's the red line, and precipitation, those are the blue bars. And this is just showing what we all know as Californians, that we live in this Mediterranean climate. Right? So we have cool, wet winters, we have warm, dry summers. And why I show this graph is because the cool, wet winters allow vegetation to grow. And we all know that. There are lots of pictures of, cured grass. And then the warm, dry summers are an opportunity for, if there's a ignition source, for that vegetation to burn. And the reason that we have fire here is that when vegetation has, a couple of fates, right? It can rot and form soil, or it can burn, but things rot when they're warm and wet. And you can see here in California, it is rarely either, right? It is either warm and dry or cool and wet. And so that's why we have these buildups of fuel that we actually have to do something about. So next slide. This is, and redwood forest, as Jessica did a good job talking about, the adaptation of fire, because fire has happened as, since this climatic epic in California, all of our systems are adapted to it, right? So redwoods, as cool and wet and shady, you don't look at this picture and think, oh, fire, that's something that's going on. But actually redwoods are what they're famous for is their resistance to fire. Everybody knows, every docent tells you how the bark doesn't have resins in it and how it's thick, and so it shields the cambium, and all of that's true. But what people who conduct prescribed burns know is that other than grass, the first thing that dries out and is available and most flammable in the Santa Cruz Mountains are redwood leaves, redwood needles, right? That's if you want to get a fire started, you just gather up a few of those and put a match in it and you're good to go. So even these cool, wet systems, they're not fire dependent. Redwoods grow in places that are so wet that they never burn, but they are fire adapted. Next slide. And this is what I was talking about earlier, is where the redwoods are fire adapted, our infrastructure isn't, right? So we haven't carefully sited infrastructure, and a lot of it was, built at the turn of the century. And a lot of it, to Jessica's point of funding this structure hardening, is something that Parks is really, really behind in, right? We have this huge maintenance backlog that we haven't been able to address. And one of the most surprising things that I saw during the CZU fire was actually that the new construction, we'd created these dishwashing stations to deal with issues we had with marbled merlets and food scraps and all of that. And they were freshly built and they had a fresh coat of paint on them, and most of them were fine. And that's the difference between a fresh coat of paint and an old coat of paint, was the difference between some of these structures actually surviving or being consumed by fire.
Wow.
Next slide. And so then, again, to this point of adaptation, and the vegetation communities is adapted, and it's adapted to fire. That's a disturbance regime. It is adapted to, and when you go in and do the kind of work that Steve is talking about doing, and the kind of fuel reduction that Jessica was talking about putting in place, that is really the most sensitive way to manage fires. If you're going in and being reactive, then you're starting to use things like bulldozers, and you're starting to, create disturbance that these communities aren't adapted to. And so that, as a state parks employee, when there's a wildfire, I know that the plant community is going to be okay. I know that our infrastructure is at risk, but what I mostly am trying to do is work with CAL FIRE to minimize the damage from suppression. So if you don't put in these fuel breaks, if you don't get ahead of these things, then you have impacts to the natural communities from the suppression efforts. Next slide. So this is Butno State Park, 2 years after the CZU, and we've kept the roads open, et cetera. But when you look at the recovery of the vegetation, it's already coming back. Things are starting to really look really quite good. And even with a huge amount of effort, we're years and years and years away from putting our infrastructure back in place. Last slide, I think. Next one. So Randy mentioned that I am involved in the prescribed burn program here in the district, and you can't burn everywhere. Burning is a very economical way to address fuel consumption and keep vegetation communities diverse, but it is difficult to do. there's a reason that the saying "playing with fire" means doing something dangerous. But also, we might as well remember the other saying that you want to fight fire with fire, right? These communities are adapted to fire, and there are some things that fire can do that you can't do with mechanical equipment. So using the sorts of treatments that Steve is talking about to set yourself up so that you can apply fire to the landscape is really a great synergy to get all of those ecological benefits of fire in the safest way that you can. Thanks, Randy.
That's fantastic. I'm so many things. There's a couple of questions that are coming to bear, and I think everybody, all of our speakers today probably think about it, but we know that we're sort of addressing some immediate concerns. But over the long haul, looking forward, what are the ways we're going to make these new approaches sustainable? Meaning of staff-wise, like we know that there's a heavy, reliance on having, qualified staff out there. Funding-wise, I've opened it up, and what are the long-term vision, or how can we support a long-term vision for sustaining this effort and really addressing this challenge over the next couple decades? Mr. Bennett or Jessica, yes, go ahead.
Go ahead, Assembly Member.
No, go ahead, Jessica. I'll respond.
Thank you. So there's a couple levels here, right? One is we have a target in California with the Forest Service of we need to be able to treat, or essentially you could call it also restore, 1 million acres a year starting in 2025. That's our target that we're scaling up towards. And then the question is, once you start doing that, you can't really stop, right? It's like the painting of the Golden Gate Bridge analogy, that because these are disturbance adapted ecologies, mostly fire adapted ecologies, that you have to then, once you do by hand what 100 years of fire should have done, then you should get to a point where you can restore natural fire or grazing or other more sort of ecological management tools. But you need to be able to keep up that maintenance of this. And so this isn't going to be the kind of thing where we just say, oh, we're done. And also we have a long way to go. I don't know if you guys read Dr. Malcolm North or Scott Stevens from UC Berkeley, but they just came out with a paper that was highlighting that our forests are significantly overstressed from their natural condition because of competition. So, so historically in the Sierra, for example, you'd have about 40 trees per acre. And instead what we're seeing is 400 trees per acre, which means when you're getting these climate conditions that are extreme heat, extreme drought, the trees are stressed out. They are then susceptible to disease or dying. And then they create a foundation for catastrophic fire, which then devastates the watershed, which then gets you back to more extreme drought conditions. So what we're seeing are these compounding cycles of climate change that are now self-reinforcing in some of our California ecologies. And so to be able to be sustainable in this front, we not only need to sort of take the questions that Tim's asking about, where do we put structures? How are they built? Are they in conditions that can withstand sort of embers and low intensity fire coming through? But also, how do we restore our ecologies so that they aren't creating these compounding cycles of climate change and have the right sort of density, structure, and type to be able to withstand the next 100 years of conditions? So I think one of our, not mistakes, but I think one of the things we've learned in California is that we've often done our planning based on past conditions, and what we now have to be able to anticipate is future conditions. And so that's what we're getting towards. And then to be able to maintain that scale, do it on the right science, the right ecology with that 100-year horizon, we also need to make sure that we have the workforce and the economic foundation to be able to expand that, right? We need more foresters, we need prescribed burners, we need fuels crews, like we're expanding the conservation corps so they can go out and do this work. We need to make sure all those workers have housing. We need more sawmills. If you're gonna go from 400 stems per acre to 40, right? You need that wood to be having a higher destination than creating competition and having our forests die out. And so we need to be able to have the infrastructure in place to be able to utilize the material that needs to come out for our ecologies to be able to withstand the climate conditions that are facing them, and that will be even more extreme in the future. But what's great is that we've got a lot of resources that we're putting towards that, incredible partners on the ground, and we're moving at an unprecedented pace. So our goal is to make sure that we move at a faster pace than the climate change, but this is a planet that we're battling. So, we need to keep our expectations in check here, but I think California is really leading the way.
So I think Jessica did a great job of explaining how important it is that we keep the effort up, and what are the key steps, like making sure you have the workforce and all of that. I'm going to come at it from the other side, and that is politically, how do you keep the effort up? And I think we have to recognize that democracies do not do a good job of taking short-term pain for long-term gain. It's just, until you have the crisis right in front of you, do you have the political momentum and the energy to take some strong action? So we've had some fires that's helped mobilize us, but we've also had some good budget years and created this opportunity. The question is, when the budget gets tough, do we continue to do this? And I don't think that there's an easy solution to that, because whether it's we're going to suffer a little bit now, so we don't have to suffer more later, question comes up with all kinds of things. What are we doing with water? What are we doing with climate change? What are we doing with fire, resiliency and protection? And the more we can talk about it, the more we can educate, the more we can have people understand that it is better for us to do this action now, rather than kick the can down the road on it, the better off we will be. But if we don't recognize how hard that is in a democracy, and how difficult it will be when the budget is in its lean times to continue this funding. And one of the solutions, I think, is to try to actually identify long-term goals that have benchmarks that sort of hold you accountable. So if we could say, look, at state parks is trying to get to, 1 million acres a year eventually, right? So what are those goals? And then try to get some commitments from people to reach those goals. So you have something to sort of have people say, hey, we're falling behind. Because if it's off the radar screen, it's really easy to fall behind. I hope that helps.
That's really great. And one of the things that, and speaking to all of our members who are on this call, I mean, the foundation, that's one of the tasks that we feel we have, is to be that advocate in Sacramento to keep those goals and those milestones. And so the great work that Jessica, you're doing, and Tim and Steve are doing, are giving us so much more in which we can rally Californians in terms of the work that they're doing. I know that we're kind of near the end. So many things. I just wanted one more question, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with Yosemite and the original land managers, the indigenous tribes that really understood this cycle of wildfire and shaped the landscape. Is there anything that the state parks is doing in particular, or the state that's working with Native tribes, that's really helping to kind of relearn from the work of those tribes and to re-engage those communities?
We've been working really closely with the Amamutsan Tribal Band, which is local peoples here, and it's, we're both learning, right? Because there has been such an impact to their culture that in the Bay Area, they've lost much of their knowledge base. And as you go further north to the Yurok and some tribes who retained that, then we're learning from them. So it's a back and forth right now, but we're deeply engaged with the local Native peoples here in Santa Cruz.
Excellent. Jessica, did you have a quick thought?
Yes, there's a lot that we're doing with tribes, also, all tribes are sort of independent nations with kind of their unique identities and knowledge base. But we just appointed our first tribal member to the California State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. And she's a forester from the Yurok tribe, and very excited to have Don Blake on this effort as well. On the Forest and Wildfire Resilience Task Force, which I'd encourage you all to engage on. That's how we're coordinating across a lot of entities on this front and working against those targets. We have Don Henkin, who is a leader in a tribal leader who is an expert in prescribed burning. And we had a number of tribal leaders help on establishing our prescribed fire and cultural burning strategy for the state. And then we're also trying to remove barriers so that we can get more cultural and prescribed burning on the landscape. So we just had huge changes to prescribed fire liability and to set up our first state fund for that would essentially act as insurance for private and cultural burners in this space. So we're really trying to invest in tribal partnerships, tribal knowledge, and a lot of those collaboratives that I was telling you about earlier are very anchored with tribal partners as well, because tribes have managed our forest effectively for millennia, and we want to make sure we get back to that state.
Thank you all, and so many things we could go through, but Steve, Assemblymember Bennett, Jessica, and Tim, thank you for your time. Everybody who's attended and on the thing, thank you all for your engagement in this. We're going to be working more and more to sort of to take these lessons and advance them further. Please feel free to check out the foundation, the work we're doing. We're currently raising funds for our next round of wildfire grants to go out. So feel free to show up for that or to show up for our volunteer program. The last thing that I just want to mention, we're super excited to announce that we have a new program manager for our climate resiliency program. We have Dr. Emily Doyle has joined the foundation as our director of climate resiliency, and she's going to bring her work from a global viewpoint to kind of combine all of our efforts. So we're deeply learning, educating, and also activating our partners, our volunteer program, and ultimately bringing all the lessons that we've learned today from all of our great speakers to the legislature, so that we know that we continue to help parks be climate resilient, and we can continue to enjoy them and fight for them. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you again. Please all have a great day, and we'll be seeing you soon, I'm sure. Our next one will be for monarch butterfly conservation. So look for it in your emails. Thank you all.
Thank you.